drive in with the extra snow. I'm Jason Myers. I'm excited to be here. We're going to start with an announcement, and then we'll dive into the Roman world.
And I'm not Jason Myers, but I wish I had the youth and vigor of Jason Myers. I'm, as most of you know, Bill Cross, and I'm helping Callie Reynolds a little bit because we saw over Christmas that there are 9 members of the parish who are at home and less mobile than they once were, and received Christmas cookies. And we would like to establish a lay Eucharistic ministry where they also receive the Eucharist. We gather informally that there are quite a number of people that would be thrilled to be lay Eucharistic ministers, which takes minimal training, but it does take filling out a form that takes 45 seconds or so to assert to the diocese that we are in fact members of Christ Church and we're baptized and so on and so forth, and implicitly we're not axe murderers. And that's where you're supposed to laugh. And so what we'd like to do is ask everybody who is interested in being a lay Eucharistic minister, periodically visiting neighbors to bring them the Eucharist, to fill out this form, which simply asks for your name and email address. That then will prompt Callie to send you an email with a link to the diocesan form. So we're just accumulating the information about who might be interested in serving in this regard. And we'll be back to you later if you are interested. Questions, comments? Okay. So I'm going to pass this around, starting with our co-warden, Jan. Thank you, Jan. And I'll collect it at the end from Mark and Jim at the back.
How many people are you talking about?
There are 9 people shut in at home. If we can, ideally, if we can have, say, 27 people who are able to be a part of the lay Eucharistic ministry, we might be able to have those 9 people at home be visited, perhaps every 3 weeks. And it wouldn't be a terrible burden on the lay Eucharistic ministers, and it would mean a lot to the people who are at home. Make sense? Thanks.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, my name is Jason Myers, and I'm a new professor at Gordon College. I was just talking with Bruce. I just started this past fall, about to start on my 2nd semester. I just got back yesterday from 10 days in the UK. I teach for a school for the last 8 years over there as well. And so I landed at Logan at about 2 p.m. yesterday, and got a good night's rest, and here we are. I was saying to Patrick, it's a little bit easier coming back because they're 5 hours ahead, so when you wake up at 5 a.m., you feel like you've slept in a little bit. So if only I could keep that pace going. But I had a lot of fun over there. I spent the last couple days in Oxford at the Bodleian doing some research and writing for a new chapter. I had to say goodbye to the library, as fun as it is. I know that's what your vacations look like. Can you be stuck up in a library for a few days? But it was a lot of fun. But I'm glad to be back and ready to start a new semester at Gordon and to start the next 8 weeks of our formation time together. As you can see on the screen, as you saw probably in the description, we're going to be taking a look over the next 8 weeks at the world of the New Testament. That is the history, the politics, the societal features that begin to bring, I think, a lot of illumination to the text of Scripture that we read. If I could give you a rough analogy, what this kind of next 8 weeks are going to be looking at is as if we were taking a picture. And sometimes in the picture, what's in focus, at least in Bible study, is the biblical text, and kind of what's blurred in the background is the world of the New Testament. So we take a look at the words, the sentences, unpack what Jesus meant, and the world of the New Testament is kind of blurred in the background, right, in the frame. What this next 8 weeks is going to do is kind of inverse that a little bit. We're going to take a look at the Roman world kind of in focus, and it's not that the New Testament is going to be blurry, but that's going to be kind of in the background rather than the foreground of the picture. The reason I think this is helpful is because when we look at these texts of Scripture, they are rooted in this ancient historical past. And my favorite definition of history is that history is like a foreign country. They do things differently there. In fact, as I mentioned, I just got back from England. What I'm currently wearing is called a jumper, not a sweater. I had to take a lift. I had to queue, right? And we share a common language, right? So only begin to imagine when we go back 2,000 years with different languages and different values and different assumptions, they do things a little bit differently there. And so as we walk through this, I think it's helpful to begin to ask some kind of historical questions that might begin to illumine some of the things that are often confusing about the New Testament. And so when we refer to the world of the New Testament, we're roughly referring to kind of from the 1st century BC all the way up to the tail end of the 1st century of the Common Era, or AD. So about 1 BC to 90, because this sets really the context and the landscape for our texts. And certainly it seems that the last of our New Testament texts are written near the end of the 1st century. And so when we begin to understand this world, it helps us to know that every character, story, dream, personality, hopes, problems that were faced are impinged upon really by these ancient historical forces. To put it simply, there is no untouched element of the New Testament that when you kind of prick it, doesn't bleed in some sense the 1st century reality. To give us a small picture of what I'm referring to, here's a text from Acts 14, kind of picked roughly at random. And I want to read it to us because this one stands out a little bit more for its kind of ancientness. And so I'll read the text on the screen. In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped and began to walk. And when the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus. Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths for the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to him. So this is a key scene in the book of Acts. Paul heals someone. But notice the response of the group is to ascribe to them some sort of Greco-Roman deity and say, oh, this what looks like what you're doing looks like this. And so this text asks a host of questions. What kind of temple was this? What did priests do? What was their job in the ancient world? How involved were the members of this local town in those religious ceremonies? Why these divinities? Why Zeus and Hermes? What about their actions spring to mind for an ancient audience to help them think of that? And then what did the community expect to happen with these sacrifices? I mean, so this is just one text of many that begins to assume a lot on our part. And that's really what I think the next 8 weeks are going to be helping us to do, is figure out what are those assumptions at work in the 1st century world that are just taken for granted, because everyone knows that's just the way things are. And really, as we approach the text of Scripture, I find often as a teacher and a professor, is helping put those assumptions on the table to help us make sense of these ancient, really unfamiliar texts. We do this all the time. All of our communication actually assumes that we have a shared kind of cultural, historical background, because if we didn't, communication would be really, really difficult to explain everything over and over and over again. And so let me give you a rough analogy. If I were to throw out the numbers 9/11, all of you know what year I'm referring to, right? 9/11 for us refers to one particular year, in the year of 2001. In fact, I would need to go out of my way to try to say, oh, I'm not referring to that 9/11, I'm referring to a different one, right? Because we share, a shared cultural reference that I only need to say the month and the year, and everyone immediately knows, because we all lived through that, right, what I'm referring to. Now imagine fast forwarding 500 years, 700 years, 1,000 years. Someone's looking over our texts, our emails, our conversations, because they all have those now, right? And they're going, okay, they keep referring to this date 9/11, but they never refer to the year. Why is that? And they might be confused until they realize, oh, let's put together a historical construction here, and they're all referring to this event. But we don't have to share that year because it's basically perfunctory at this point, right? And so that's the set of questions I'm interested in when I come to the New Testament, are what are the analogs to that? What were the things that they just didn't even think to mention because they just know that everybody knows that's the way things are. And I find when we do that, a lot of the New Testament, and really all of Scripture, can kind of spring to life with like oh, that's why that is the way it is. And so as we work to do this, we obviously rely on ancient history. And so when we ask the question, how do we know what we know? You can sum it up in kind of two big pieces. Literary sources and archaeology. That's how we begin to mine, really, the ancient world for this. And so we rely on literary sources. Most of our knowledge of the Greco-Roman world comes from ancient texts that people left. And we try to dissect those to begin to put together how people thought, what their expectations were, their values. And we have hundreds and thousands of texts from philosophers, from historians, from poets, from lawyers that begin to build out our ancient world. One of the difficulties with this, though, at least in the ancient world, are that all these sources come from one particular vantage point. That is, roughly high-status elite men who are literate and who can write and whose society wants to preserve their words, right? We don't have as much from other groups, so we'll move to that in a minute. When we look at the historians, and this is just kind of the homework, if you will, we rely on a lot of people like Polybius, Thucydides, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, Philo. These are the persons with whom have left a large literary output from which we can begin to paint a picture. We have lots of philosophers that we rely on, like Cicero, Plutarch, Epictetus, Seneca, Pliny the Younger. We won't be referencing these, but these are the sources to whom we go often to build out what we know. We have poets like Virgil and Ovid, Horace, Juvenal, these authors who put poetry to work, and we actually learn a lot about that. The other place we look, of course, is archaeology. When we want to begin to look at how people lived, we can actually begin to pair that with literary sources and build out a more fuller picture. So, of course, you can begin to think of great Roman archaeological sites, like the Colosseum behind me, the Roman Forum, theaters, all those things. But we also use things like coins and inscriptions and sculptures that begin to walk us into that world of the ancients so that we can begin to look at various pieces of that ancient world and see how people lived, what they thought. Because what they put down in coins, like emperors, in sculptures or inscriptions like the one behind me, this is a funerary inscription, we can begin to say, okay, here's what they at least wanted the world to know, right, in that sense, about themselves. As I mentioned, these largely come from the higher kind of elite sections of the Roman Empire, but that doesn't leave us, in some ways, in the dark. We can study what we call material culture, that is ancient homes, the products that are in them to begin to build a portrait of ancient society. We could do this today, right? If we, in a very non-creepy way, were to rummage through your home without you there, right? We could begin to build a social profile for who you are without ever having met you. We would, in again, non-creepy way, look at the tags on your clothes and say, okay, is this Target? Is this high-end fashion designers? We look at the quality of the materials in your kitchen. What type of cookware are you using? What's the artwork on your walls? Is it, kids' drawings on a refrigerator? Or is it like, a Jackson Pollock or something, and we could begin to build out a profile saying, okay, this would be the type of person that would have lived in this home. And so that's what archaeologists do in Pompeii and Rome and Ephesus, is we can begin to build out a large portrait of people who never left any words for us to study, sadly, of what their lives looked like. And so we use material culture to do this. And when we join those together, we actually know a lot about the Roman world. We know a lot about the ways that people lived in Jerusalem or Ephesus or Thessalonica, that allows us to begin to see what issues they were going through and what kind of made up their life together. To begin with, right, we're talking about the Roman Empire. Here's a map from a later era, from I think the 2nd century. And it's a vast empire, and every character that we meet in the New Testament lives underneath the Roman Empire. We're going to look together here in a little bit on how that bears on particular passages within the New Testament. But this is a massive empire. I mean, post Alexander the Great, this is the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from North Africa all the way over to Spain, up to modern-day England and Scotland, which they called the Swampy Island, all the way over to trade routes in China and India. So it's a massive empire. In fact, in terms of classics, the Roman Empire is one of the first in which we can begin to discuss something like a gross domestic product, a GDP, because of their extensive trade routes. They can be studied. So it's a massive reach of an empire. To give you a little bit more of a handle on how large that is, this might bend your mind a little bit, but this is the Roman Empire on our country, kind of juxtaposed. I'm a kid of the 90s, and we grew up with this thing called Magic Eye, where you had to like look at something and then another image would come forth, right? You kind of have to do that with this picture. I know it's a little small. But if you notice, right, in the Midwest, we have Italy and Greece. It's the Midwest of the ancient world, right? Over here where we are, right, modern-day Turkey is over here. Over here is Spain. You can see the North African rim there. So a very large empire, essentially spans the length of our country in terms of its reach. Obviously, this is going to, from a Roman standpoint, begin to exercise some problems for them as they try to rule an empire that large of different cultures, languages, values, and customs. In terms of our timeline, just because might be aware that not everyone is keeping the Roman timeline in their heads from day to day, we are more interested in the Roman Empire. So obviously the group starts off as being ruled by kings, quickly becomes a republic, and then after Augustus, largely moves to what we call an empire, basically on the terms that they're using to describe themselves. And so the New Testament is largely rooted in this long era of about 300 to 400 years of Roman rule, building on what had come before. So the stories of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and the like are very much in the rearview mirror by the time of Paul and Jesus. That is, in some ways, ancient history for them. And they're in the years of the emperors, right? Nero, Claudius, Domitian, a thriving empire. As I mentioned in my description, right at the tail end of the 1st century, going into the 2nd century, the Roman Empire is at its zenith. It's at full force. Things are going very, very well for it. The battles are largely kept at bay, and they really are sitting on top of a very, very powerful group. But if we go back to the founding, right, this looms large in Roman minds. I have a picture of the Capitoline wolf, known as Lupa. And if you've ever gone to Rome, you probably see this on coins, on little souvenirs you can buy. And this is really, in many ways, the way Rome wanted to image themselves. And I think it's an interesting choice. Here we have Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome, being raised by a she-wolf. And so I want to kind of throw that out there. Why do you think Rome begins to image themselves with this picture? What does that animal bring to mind for you?
Power.
Power? Yep.
Cunning.
What was that?
Cunning.
Cunning? Yep. Very, very smart.
Fierce.
Fierce? Yep.
Responsibility?
Yeah, in what way? With the feeding?
despite all the previous adjectives, this animal is a she-wolf, not just any wolf, and B, providing for these two little boys.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't seem obvious parts of her family.
Yeah.
But somehow there is a system in place whereby there is something that's working across differences.
Yeah.
Lots of differences.
Yeah, even animal-human differences, right? Yeah, that's a helpful image because there's a juxtaposition with the image, right? There's like the caring, nurturing side of feeding, right? Juxtaposed with this really kind of vicious outward look, right? And so the image really does communicate all the things you mentioned: cunning, violence, right?
Wolves are also social.
Social animals, yep. So society wrapped up in the picture. And really the main thing that we've touched upon is this kind of inward outward. Towards the outside, right, Rome is vicious and powerful. And it is saying if you come on the inside, there's care, there's nurture, there's society. And so you have this kind of inward outward juxtaposition that Rome is essentially offering to the Roman world of you don't want to be on the outside, you want to be on the inside. So it kind of shapes their view of societies, of as long as they can provide and take care of by submission, right? They're willing to be very caring and nurturing and helping, right? But don't find yourselves on the outside. Let Rome rule. So this image comes to be pretty fundamental to kind of that inside-outside divide of the Roman Empire. As they expand, they're including more in their reach, and this becomes the ways that they project themselves to the world. It is an odd mixture of both violence, right, towards the outside world, and trying to run an empire, to care for it in a pretty substantial way. As you saw on the map, that's a large section of the world to provide peace for, to provide stability, security, and we're going to unpack those as we go through. But that really is what they are offering, right, to the known world, is we can be that protector for you. If you just kind of come underneath us, we will fight for you. This is a lot of the ways that Roman treaties work. Part of going into the treaty with Rome is that it's kind of like NATO, right? We will fight on your behalf. As long as you pay us taxes and give us allegiance, right? We will defend you. This story, of course, is rooted in two mythological characters, Aeneas and Romulus and Remus, and we won't do a deep dive on them. But essentially, Aeneas, that story kind of coming out of the Aeneid, is that which forms a people. This is a people who have left. And then Romulus and Remus are about the founding of a place, right? So they found Rome. And it doesn't leave the Roman mind that the Roman city was founded in some ways on bloodshed, right? Brother killing brother, if you remember the story. So in fact, anytime anything bad happened in Rome, they actually sometimes thought of this story and go, oh, this is punishment because a brother killed a brother. And that's how we founded our empire. But this story of Aeneas looms large in that he founds a place and he founds a people that are kind of a mixture, right? As we think about the Roman Empire, it's often, I think, misunderstood that not everybody who even lived in Italy was considered a Roman citizen. They distinguished between Italians and Roman citizens. There was even a distinction there on geography. And Rome really was trying to build, in some ways, a cosmopolitan empire that stretched across time and place. And so the founding story of Aeneas really, I think, roots that in someone who moves to a place and finds a new identity in that. And so these stories root themselves. Aeneas is the son of Aphrodite and Venus. So love is at the root of that story, to sum it up. And Romulus and Remus are sons of Mars, the god of war. And so in these two founding stories, you have love and war right at the center. And that will begin to narrate, right, the Roman Empire, this deep love of art and literature and buildings and sculptures, the things that we think of, and the war machine, right? Like it's two juxtapositions there, kind of in their founding story. We're going to skip the founding of Rome, but it begins, of course, as a republic. That's why it has a senate and senators. A lot of our founding of our country was built off a Roman ideal of having not a dictator, not one person in charge, not a king. And so they left behind kings and moved to a republic. And so they had a senatorial class that would make decisions. And this is largely what Julius Caesar kind of brings to an end, is the republic by crossing over the Tiber. And so as this moves, right, that civil war between Julius Caesar and Cato and Pompey brings an end to the republic, right? There's too much power, there's too much on the line. And there are many reasons why they think the republic fell, and even the Roman Empire. And if you go and read down through them, it's a little scary because the world we're living in now kind of matches some of those things, like inaction to pass laws, too much power in the hands of the few, wealth inequality, all these issues that brought down the fall of the Roman Empire, you can begin to map onto modern day problems as well. And so as I read those to students sometimes, I try to remind them this is the first century, not the 21st century. But they could be forgiven for being confused because it does paint out a very socially conflicted world in that sense. And so this founding of the Republic does loom large. There is this idea, even through the empire, that the Republic's going to be restored. In fact, at the changing of the guard of every emperor, the Senate actually gets really, really excited. It's like, it's now the time we're going to go back to the Republic. It never happens. But they always have this mind in them that the Republic was the heyday of the Roman Empire. We were making decisions together. We were passing laws. And again, Julius Caesar brings us to an end with the kind of assuming of imperial power with that. As we go through this era, we have a bunch of Roman emperors. I want to kind of begin to locate them. So I have some of the major ones on the screen. We start, of course, with Augustus, who's first called Octavian. That's his kind of birth name. He gets the name Augustus, meaning revered one, or powerful one. And then, of course, the term princeps, which means kind of first among equals. It's a very nuanced term because he doesn't want to claim the term that Caesar had, because we saw how that ended, right, in a bloodbath. And so he wants the power, he wants the title, but he is really the first emperor in that sense, to have kind of one person rule of the the empire. Still, of course, working with the Senate to pass laws, but they largely are rubber stamping the things that he wants done through the empire. We'll walk down through these. We have Tiberius, Caligula, Nero. Then when Nero dies, we have what's called the Year of the Four Emperors, where there are four emperors in quick succession because there are a lot of assassinations happening, one after the other. So they go through a string of four emperors in 1 year, which is very destabilizes a lot, you can imagine, of who's in control. At the end of that, a guy named Domitian ends up on top of the heap, and then around there Vespasian. And so these are the emperors that really narrate the timeline of the New Testament. We just celebrated Christmas, right? And even in Luke's gospel, right, we have Jesus born underneath the reign of Emperor Augustus. And then the book of Revelation, we think, is written somewhere near the tail end of Domitian's reign there. And so it really spans the timeline of the New Testament. To put it in a really simple way, right, whose picture is up in the post office when these books are being written? Who's the guy in charge? It helps us to know at various standpoints because it really sheds light onto what's happening here. So for example, as I mentioned, Augustus is the emperor at the birth of Jesus, mentioned in chapter 2, verse 1. He dies roughly quickly right after Jesus is born, and Tiberius is the next emperor. And Tiberius is largely the emperor, the guy in control during the life of Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection. He's the one running the empire. They're the one that people in Judea would think of as being in control of the Roman world. Shortly after him, we have Caligula, who many know from kind of his infamous stories. And he is basically the early portion of the book of Acts. He reigns from 37 to 41, a short reign, but nonetheless, he's the emperor there. And then perhaps more important is Nero. He is the emperor for all the writings of Paul's letters. And we're going to take a look at a text in just a minute. And then we have after Nero, again, the Year of the Four Emperors. We don't have really any New Testament text around this time, but this is when Jerusalem falls. In the year 70 is when the temple is destroyed, and that is done by Titus. And at this time, he's the one who destroys the temple in Jerusalem. So a very significant event for Jerusalem with the destruction of Herod's temple after the revolt of the Jews starting about 3 or 4 years before that. The Romans conquered Jerusalem and turned it into a Roman city after that. And then after that, we have Titus and Domitian. This is when the book of Revelation, we think, was written. And actually, all 4 of our Gospels, we believe, were written during the time of Domitian. And there are ways in which we see this story kind of reflecting those emperors. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, one of the great confessions, right, is Peter's confession of Jesus, my Lord and my God, is what he says to Jesus. That was actually a coined phrase by Domitian, who was one of the few emperors that within his life wanted to be worshipped as a divine being while he was still alive. And many John scholars think that John is kind of juxtaposing Jesus' rule with Domitian, who rightly claims those titles. And we'll look at that a little bit next week when we look at Roman religion. There's a rising what we call imperial cult, the worship of the emperor in divine terms. And only 2 emperors require that in their lifetime, and that's Nero and Domitian. They wanted to be worshipped while they were living, with sacrifices, a temple, prayers, adoration, divine terms. Most emperors didn't get that till after they died, and so they kind of stand out in that sense there. As we go through, feel free to ask questions if things come up. We don't have to wait till the end. I'm used to working with students, so hands go up all the time. And so feel free if something comes up to kind of interject. I do want to take a quick look at one piece here that I think shows us where the Roman world comes kind of barreling down on us in the New Testament. And so I'm going to pull up a pretty famous text. This is where I was before. So I should have had this pulled up. All right, we have Romans 13, 1 on the screen. And let me put up the one that's a little bit more readable. And I can make that bigger for you. So this is a famous passage. I'm sure we've all read it, heard it quoted, and the like. Paul writing to the Romans in the capital city, a city that he's never been to at this time, writes, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God." So this is a generic text. When we read it, we go, okay, Paul's referring to some Roman government. But when we begin to see when Paul writes, he's actually referring to one person there in terms of the governing authorities. In terms of the Roman Empire, his audience would be thinking of one person, and that's Nero, right? He's the emperor to whom this refers. And this, of course, is a famous text on which a lot of people philosophize about Christian kind of political theory. But it's, I would argue, rooted in a particular time and place. Because as you read through this text, I want us to look at Romans 13, because he's making an argument, right? If you remember your logic classes, all arguments are built on premises from which you draw conclusions, right? And so in Romans 13:1, we're looking at a conclusion: be obedient to the governing authorities. And I want us to work down through the first 4 verses and see the premise on which Paul derives that conclusion. Does anyone see the premise in the first 4 verses? There's a couple, but one of them is pretty significant. Why does Paul argue that the citizens in Rome ought to be obedient? He gives a couple reasons.
Verse 3 is standing out to me.
Which one?
Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good, cannot put to bad. There's
Yeah.
an assumption that the rulers rule in a certain way.
Yeah, that one to me is key. In fact, that was the one I hope we saw. That this, I believe, is the significant premise from which the whole passage revolves around. That at some level, rulers, the Roman government, are punishing bad conduct and rewarding good conduct at the most general level. right? So they are punishing wrongdoing, they're not punishing, not causing fear for good conduct. The reason why this one is significant is this one actually, as I mentioned earlier, if you like prick it, it's going to bleed the first century, but this is the part where we kind of miss. Because when Paul writes this, I mentioned Nero is the emperor. But if you know anything about Nero's reign, it's kind of in two parts. And this one is significant. We think Romans was written in the context of what we often call, where'd the slide go? There it is. Next one. That's strange. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. So we can talk about Nero in general, but if you're thinking about the Roman Empire and those living during the time when Romans is written, it's written in a very specific period of Nero's reign. So as later historians of the first century, like Suetonius, reflected on Nero's reign, they labeled it with a title. It's one of my favorite Latin words because it's fun to say. It's the quinquennium of Nero. It's the golden age of Nero. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were characterized by later historians as the golden years or the good years. And again, if someone is categorizing your life as the good years, there's something else coming, right? And so there's a turn, and the historians place this in the year 62. According to Tacitus, this is when the wheels start to come off the cart, because Nero sadly kills his mother, Agrippina, which is awful. And then he fires his general Burrus and has his other friend Seneca commit suicide. So in the first 5 years of Nero's reign, his mother Agrippina helps him get on the throne. I think a whole movie could be written about Agrippina because she is working behind the scenes to get Nero on the throne. And so because he's young, he has a general named Burrus that helps him with all military things. And then he has Seneca, the moral philosopher, as his own personal philosopher to help him on moral issues. Seneca will write him a book in honor of his reign called De Clementia, on mercy, where Nero is admonished to reign with justice, to use mercy to reign. So when Nero takes the throne, he distances himself from Caligula, whose reign ended in a bloodbath of lots of like secret trials, killings of Roman citizens. And very interestingly enough, when Nero takes the throne, he says, I'm not going to rule by the sword, I'm going to rule by the Senate. And he wants to distance himself from Caligula and saying it's not going to be like that. It's going to be justice, the laws, no more secret trials. We're not going to have these conspiracy theories on people anymore. I'm going to put away the sword, and I'm going to reign with justice. And essentially, Burrus and Seneca are, as I like to picture them, the two little good angels on his shoulders, helping him make good choices. Seneca is a renowned moral philosopher, helping him do that. And so the first 5 years are characterized as these golden years. Things are seemingly going well. He's listening to his advisors, not using violence to achieve his ends. And again, this all turns in 62, which what we think is some sort of mental break that Nero had. We're not entirely sure what happened, but there is a shift. And after, as you might imagine, killing your mother, a lot of things go downhill, right, in terms of like the psychological event of that. And of course, after this is the fires in Rome in 64, and then it ends in chaos. And so the reason why I bring that up is when we read Romans 13:7, and we see Paul admonishing those in Rome to be subject to Nero, he's writing during that kind of ascent of the golden years. Things seem like they're going in the right direction. It seems like Nero is rewarding good conduct and punishing bad conduct. Again, we think Romans is written in 55 or 56, right in the middle of those good years. Now, of course, by the year 64, when we have the fires in Rome, many of these statements will not be true, right? Because Nero, of course, is most famous in terms of his relationship to the early Christians with killing them, with them becoming martyrs, right? He burns them at the stake, lights them on fire by dipping them in oil, decapitates them, for just being Christians. And so by 64, this statement here in Romans 13:1, we're going to have a big problem here with verse 3. Because Christians are being punished for seemingly good conduct, right? And so when we kind of situate Romans 13 within that kind of environment, it really sheds light on why Paul says what he says and when he says it. This is something that is said within a particular context. And notice again, we had language of the sword, the very thing that Nero said he's distancing himself from. And again, this whole thing is kind of pivoting. There's a general semblance of justice that's being enacted in the Roman Empire, which sadly in a few years, at a macro level, is going to take a marked shift by the year 64. We get some later books in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Revelation, where now we're in the 90s, and in Revelation 18, the author of Revelation, which John, whoever it is going to actually call for the overthrow and the downfall of Rome. Babylon is John's nickname for Rome. And he's going to talk about Rome falling because of the injustice that it practices. And Revelation 18 is this big economic critique of the Roman Empire and of Domitian and his rule. And so it helps us to see that the New Testament is written in particular political contexts, and sometimes their documents reflect in some ways the major kind of ups and downs of that. Yeah?
Thanks for all this.
Yeah.
And I walked in a few minutes late, so I apologize
Yeah.
if this was addressed. Can you speak to the logistics of a letter from Paul to the Romans? Like, did he write one letter? Was it multiple letters?
Mhm.
How many Christians were in Rome? Did they all have access to this
Mhm.
letter? Did this
Yeah.
letter go? Did the authorities, did the Roman authorities have access to this letter? And like, what is known about all that?
Yeah, those are all really, really great questions, and we didn't address them at the beginning. So,
Summarize?
yeah, so the summary is basically, how does Paul communicate with his audiences? Do they receive multiple letters? Does Paul, is there any sense that the Roman government is getting access to these and reading them? And so kind of the pragmatics of communication in the ancient world. So in short, what we find, at least from the book of Acts, is that Paul will go to a community like Ephesus or Thessalonica or Philippi. He'll stay there anywhere from a couple weeks to up to 3 years. So he stays about 2.5 to 3 years in Ephesus, about 18 months in Corinth. Other ones are shorter. He'll basically preach in what's called the agora or the forum, the marketplace, where people are. He'll preach about Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. He'll gather a following. He'll start off in the synagogue. He quickly gets kicked out of there. And then he basically founds house churches. We're going to talk about those in a couple weeks. Where early Jesus followers gather to do what we see in Acts 2 and 4. Break bread, pray, read scripture, and receive instruction from the apostles. At some point, Paul will move on. He'll leave Corinth. He'll leave Ephesus. And then because he's not present, right, the only way to communicate with them is to write letters. And so for some communities, we have multiple. So obviously 1 Corinthians, we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Romans, we only have Romans. But even in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we get little glimpses that Paul has been writing to them, and they've been writing to Paul. And so it appears that Paul, I would argue, stays in kind of constant contact with his communities. I think we often think about Paul as like a McDonald's franchise, that he's just like starting it, getting it running, and leaving. That's actually not true. In fact, if you read through the book of Acts, he goes through the region of Galatia 3 times to check up on his churches that he started there, and then he writes them Galatians. And so there's multiple levels of contact that Paul has with these communities via literary letters. So what he'll often do is he will tap someone to deliver the letter, so he'll write it. So I'm going to problematize my own language. He will use a scribe, usually, to write his letters for him. So for example, even in Romans 16, verse 17? Yeah. We find little greetings from people who have helped write the letters. I'm sorry, the font size is throwing me off here with where this passage is. Where'd it go? Am I missing it? Verse 5. No.
Well,
that's where Paul is greeting the people that he knows. Where's Tertius? Where'd he go? I'm looking for Tertius. Where'd Tertius go? Oh, right there. Verse 22. So notice at the end of Romans, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. So as I joke with my students, I could give them a really, really poor test question and say, true or false, Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And I joke, I was like, I'm not that kind of professor, so I'm not going to be mean to you like that. But technically, Paul did not write the letter to the Romans. Tertius did. In terms of who put, kind of colloquially, stylus to papyrus, right? Who was doing that? It was Tertius. And that's largely because most of the ancient world is largely illiterate. And there's lots of reasons for that, but roughly 10% of the ancient world knew how to read and write. And so you were going to dictate your letters to scribes. Everyone does this, even emperors, major people like Seneca, the philosophers. They're all using scribes to write their texts down. And so Paul will use a scribe in lots of ways they can do that. They can do dictation, so word by word. They can do we know there's a scribal like shorthand, think like court stenographer. So as someone's talking, they're just taking notes, and then they'll go build it out. We also know of examples of writers saying, hey, go write me a speech on justice, and they'll go work through all their letters and speeches and write something for them and publish it in their name. So we know lots of different kind of scribal practices. We still use these today, right? If you've read any memoir from a celebrity, right, they've had help. Probably from an English major, right, who's looking for a good job, right, to help them craft their narrative, right? Eric Clapton is not sitting down and writing word by word his biography. We also, we realize that there's extensions of authors where someone can create a speech for someone. Every time we have a State of the Union, we're realizing that, right? The president isn't sitting down in the Oval Office on a MacBook going, what shall I say to the American people, right? We can credit the West Wing for we know how this works, right? They have speechwriters that go and write them a speech, and then they edit it, right? And so those same scribal practices are actually in the first century world as well. And so here with Romans, it looks like Paul used Tertius to create Romans. And this is largely because these are the people who are trained in writing, grammar, language that can really write nice letters, right? And so it appears Paul uses these. And then once the letter's written, Paul writes Romans from Corinth. And so Paul taps someone named Phoebe here in 16 verse 1 to be the letter carrier and reader. And so this language here at the beginning, I commend you, it sounds really simple to us. Like it's like a personal reference, like, hey, she's a nice person, right? That's actually technical language. We have lots of Egyptian papyri. And this is technical language for letter carriers. It's basically listen to the person carrying this letter. They're carrying it with my authority. And we think that the letter carrier, like Phoebe, would have had the job of reading the letter aloud, and then also interpreting it for the audience. Because remember, Paul's not there. And so she's helping walk through and explain. Now, as a scholar of Romans, we really wish we had Phoebe's notes, because that would be super helpful at various places, a lot of places. But we don't. But Phoebe would have carried the letter, read it aloud for Paul in his place, and then interpreted it for the audience. This gets really interesting because as we look at text, or I have the Greek text up here on the right, this is really clean. Ancient texts have no spaces, no paragraph. They have a couple paragraph breaks, but everything's written in what we call scriptio continuum, because papyri is so expensive. So to produce a document takes a lot of money to produce, because texts are very, very expensive in the ancient world. And so the fact that the early Jesus community, and obviously Jews before them, are creating texts just shows the value of kind of the written word for communication. And so they write in scriptio continuum because they're trying to cram as much content onto the page as they can. And so Phoebe's job would not only be just to simply read it like I read to you today, but to actually put in the breaks in the text. And so we often think that letter carriers would sit down with the author and walk through the text together to say, hey, this is what I'm saying here, this is what I'm saying here, so that you can go then and espouse it, right? And so Paul uses a host of coworkers. If memory serves me right, it's somewhere between 40 and 60, I think, named people in Paul's letters. So again, we often think of Paul as like the lone ranger. He's got a network of 60 people that he works with to keep this thing going. And so Paul will do that right back and forth. In terms of the Roman Empire, we don't have any evidence that Roman emperors read these texts. So we don't think Nero is reading Romans 13. This is really written for a minority religious community in the Roman Empire. So he probably doesn't care at some level what they're saying. But even there, right, this letter, lots of scholars have helped us read it. It's kind of written in kind of double speak, kind of coded language, because there's lots here that if Nero did read it, parts would be probably okay, and other parts would not be for him, right? So the first one, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Now, Nero might have a little bit of a qualm with this if he ever read it, because Nero, again, thinks of himself in divine terms. But at a broad level, Nero believes that the Roman gods want him serving. So he could read that and go, well, yeah, the gods support my rule. Look around, right? That's why I'm in control. But of course, reading this from Paul's point of view, I like to mention, this God is very specific for Paul, right? This isn't the Roman gods. This is Yahweh. And so I think if you read Romans 13 kind of in context, it's actually quite subversive. Paul is saying be obedient to the Romans because the Romans are underneath the authority of Yahweh. This group that Rome conquered, the Romans are not thinking of themselves underneath Yahweh's rule. And yet Paul writes in the first century and says, no, actually Yahweh is in control. He's the one behind all of this. And so kind of for that reason, obey. Yeah.
Given the fact that there are these scribes who are working under Paul, and he's communicating these really complex theological realities in his letter, I mean, particularly in Romans. But
Yeah.
Where's the quality control? How could they be sure that it was going to be parsed properly?
Yeah, so the question is where's the quality control on that? And part of that is the part where we might get a little unsettled. We want much more close contact. So part of it's a simple and part of it's a complex answer. One, at least at the basic level, right, they are comfortable with this. And that's largely because that's how all communication works. If you're sending a letter across space, geography, you are giving up in some ways that control. And so letter writing in the ancient world really was a second option. You would prefer to be in person with the group because what has power in the ancient world is rhetoric, public speaking. That's really persuasive. So you notice in Paul's letters, it says he doesn't have a very powerful presence, but his letters are weighty. And that is a sense of saying, Paul says, I'm actually a better letter writer than I am a public speaker. And so he prefers this route. And then part of that is he's just separate. He can't keep crisscrossing the Roman Empire. But yeah, ancients would prefer to be in person, to have it word of mouth. But this is the second best option. In terms of quality control, I mean, I think there's a sense where the writers would sit down with their author and walk them through. But yeah, they are really giving up a lot of authority in that sense to that person to say, hey, go read it in this way, and hoping that they do. Again, we don't really have any evidence that a letter was misinterpreted, although we do have little places, like in 1 Peter, where that author will say, many have read Paul's letters and distort them and twist them to their own destruction. So there is a sense where we are not the first people to come to Paul's letters and go, we're kind of confused with what's going on. That seems to be a kind of general reaction to his work. And yeah, so there is little glimpses that people are misinterpreting parts of his letters based on what they're hearing. And you even see that when Paul rewrites to a community, like in Thessalonians, he'll have to come back and recover some ground and say, wait, you really misunderstood that point. Same with Corinthians as well.
So I'm glad you mentioned 1 Peter, because, I mean, to me, the fact that Paul's letters were written in this pivotal moment, when, the good Nero was fast disappearing, to be replaced by the bad Nero, would also have an impact on interpretation, particularly over time.
Yeah.
Is this the most expansive place in the letters for for the ascription of authority ultimately from God to these broken earthly rulers? Because you think about 1 Peter 2, Titus 3,
Yep.
even Colossians 1:16,
Yep.
and there are a number of places where, in a much more abbreviated way, there is this concept that we live in the world, but we're not
Yeah.
meant to be of the world, and we need to be respectful of human authority, even when that authority is at best a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Is this sort of the mother lode here?
Yeah, I would say Romans 13 and Revelation 18 are probably our most expansive texts on specifically addressing the empire. We have little, like, as you mentioned, little throwaway lines in some ways of honor the emperor, pay your taxes, where I think it is assumed, this is the part where I think where we step back and what I like to call the kind of horizon of interpretation, we miss it. That all of these persons live within the Roman Empire. There's no elections, there's no candidates that you're putting forward. It largely is a dictatorship. And so there isn't the sense of what choices do we have. And so this is just the way the world works. Like, the Roman Empire is there. We are not changing that as early Jesus followers or Romans. And so I think where we sit today, it is a really interesting vantage point where we have access to power. And in terms of what the ancient world imagined, we might even just have to say they might not even imagined a world in which that was possible. Because Paul is not interested in, hey, get your guy into the Roman Senate or get your guy on the emperor's throne. That's not how any of that works, right? You inherit the Senate. And so I think it does kind of change their horizon of view to say, like, this is the world, this is our existence. And so in that light, obedience is the only way forward in some ways. Rome reacts pretty violently, as you probably all well know, to disobedience and stepping out of line. So in some ways, for these fledgling minority communities, if they're not doing this at a general level, like, bloodshed is going to happen next. Like, the streets are going to flow with blood. And so in some ways, I like to contextualize Paul's comments here as a stopgap. This is what keeps his community safe at some level. Because to do otherwise is to risk bloodshed. And I'll kind of finish with this because it's 10:15. I think at like a macro level, this is rather interesting. When you look at Genesis to Revelation as a whole, right, there's really only 2 periods of time in which, I'll use this phrase, the people of God have kind of everything they want, right? So if you look at the periods of David and Solomon, where they had kind of have independent rule, in the period of the Maccabees, right before the birth of Jesus, you have Jewish independence. Outside of those 2 domains, and it's roughly, I don't know, 180 years, I'll defer to Joanna, our Samuel scholar here. Go with me, I'm not a math person either. But you basically have about 180 years of Jewish independence where they have a king on the throne, the enemies are kind of at bay roughly, and they're charting their course forward. Outside of that, from Genesis to Revelation, every person you meet is living under an empire. Whether that's the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so when I kind of step back from that at a macro level, it seems, at least within God's providence, that he hasn't sought to relieve that tension, right? So we have more periods like Daniel, and we have more periods like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Paul underneath Roman rule, that the people of God do not have their political desirable outcomes. They're living in a mitigated reality. And so the thing is, if you look at the whole like swath of scripture, the only thing I can take from that is that seems to be almost intentional. And I think that's where things like discernment and faithfulness and loyalty rise up. When you don't have all the cards and you're not being able to, map your way forward, but how do you live a faithful life to Yahweh when your world might be against you or at best indifferent towards you, let alone positive towards you, right? So much of the scriptures are written in this world in which they don't have everything the way that they want. And so this is actually much more common of how do we do that and still remain faithful to Yahweh. And I think that sums up a lot of scripture from a political quote standpoint. So yeah, and so in some ways, all of scripture is kind of navigating how do you navigate empire as the people of God when those ways of looking at our lives, our world, don't align. And sometimes they're at cross purposes, right? And I think this is where a lot of the scriptures kind of come alive and say, what does it mean to be faithful here and now? I think that's obviously, as we close, that's obviously for us as well. How do we remain faithful here and now? So I'll finish with that. I look forward to next week. Yeah, that's all I got for today.
Thank you.
Sure.